this particular displacement policy. We had some discussion earlier as it relates to policies that may or may not be required to come before the board. This particular policy, and you may have this already in the package, but I don't want to circulate a copy. You should have a copy.
Is it the existing policy?
That's correct. I had mentioned, commissioners, once before that there was, I felt a strong need for a thorough review of all of our policies. And of course, we've already discussed some of those policies in prior meetings over the last 6 months. And so in doing that, this is one that I really thought that was just very eye-opening. So I wanted to give a professional assessment of this policy by a professional in the industry for human resources, labor, and employment related business. So I spoke with Mr. Attorney Arnold Perle a month or so ago and asked him to do a singular review for me of this policy and to give me a professional assessment of this policy. And so he's here today to provide that assessment to the board. And so I'm going to ask Attorney Perle if he would give that assessment. He'll address any questions related to that. And then at least the board can be aware of this policy as such. And I can kind of share some other background as it relates to this policy. Mr. Perle.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the board. I was asked by the President, as he stated, to review this particular personnel policy, 22-21, displaced employees. The request was to review it to determine its reasonableness, specifically its impact on the division's flexibility. And we were requested further to evaluate whether such policy is typical of policies with other employers in both the public and the private sector, including whether or not such policy typically covers both management and so-called bargaining unit employees. And finally, we were requested that we comment on the potential financial liability to the division as a result of this particular policy. For starters, we noted the frequent reference to the word permanent employees in this policy. One of your distinguished board members in the private sector, human resources, I think would be perhaps among the first to recognize that referring to anyone as permanent employees is quite inappropriate. None of us in Tennessee are permanent employees. I mean, the standard in the state of Tennessee, the applicable standard is employment at will. Even board members are not permanent. And I serve on boards like you do. None of us are, quote, permanent. Our view of what we see typically is in distinguishing employees between so-called temporary employees and others is the use of regular employees or regular full-time employees. I mean, you have regular employees who are either full-time or part-time. You can have regular part-time employees. So while we were not asked to comment on that, I would be remiss if I didn't point out at the very outset that the use of the term permanent employees anywhere in this or any other policy to us is not the norm. It's not to us advisable to use that because it creates an expectation that is just not so. Going further, we noted, and I think this is a very serious problem in this particular policy, that part of the policy that is being used here is actually missing. If we look at the policy at page 3, if you could turn to the policy at page 3, at the very bottom, and then look at the very top of the policy at page 4, excuse me, it's pages 2 and page 3. You see at the bottom of page 2, at the very bottom, if it is not possible to place the employee within the respective vice president's departments. And then it goes on to page 3 with the words personnel department and placing the employee. Now, that's obviously not correct. There's something missing here. There's a gap. And yet, there's not any spaces reflecting a gap, but there's something seriously missing. And the only way to really determine what's missing here would be to go back to the original policy, which was adopted in more than 20 years ago, 21 years ago, and then look at the restatements or revisions of the policy in 1989, 1996, 2 times in 1996. And we're told that the computer software does not track those revisions. So there's a policy in place here that is just not right. Somehow, somewhere on the way to the form, something got left out here. And it's hard to determine what's left out. And since this is a very significant part of the policy, and there's a gap, I think that the division is exposed, and I think those who are looking to this policy for guidance, because after all, these policies are just for guidance. You know, at the very beginning of the policy manual, it states clearly that none of these policies are intended to create an employment contract. Indeed, in Tennessee, the applicable standard is employment at will. These statements are intended, as the policy manual, I think, correctly sets forth at the very beginning, and I've talked to the general counsel about this, as guidance. And if we have gaps in a policy, it can hardly create the necessary guidance for the benefit of all those who look to the policy for guidance. So the use of permanent employees, a gap in a policy, if there was nothing even else, I would submit for your consideration that this policy would need to be revised. Now, in our view, the policy really should either be significantly revised, if not rescinded, because when you look at the policy, the purpose of this policy, which is very clearly stated, item 1, purpose, to outline the steps to be followed in finding work assignments for displaced employees, and to define the employment status of displaced employees during the placement process. That's the purpose. There are other policies that you have that deal with compensation, others with termination. This is on displacement and the process to be followed during the placement process. There is nothing in this purpose, or there is nothing in the policy statement, which is Roman numeral number 5 on page 2, that speaks to the concept of salary continuation or pay protection. When you look at the policy statement, it is the policy of the division to avoid separating permanent employees, there's that word again, as a result of job displacement, and it goes on from there. But the defining statement here is the purpose, describing an attempt here to define the process during the placement. Now, despite the fact that the policy, the purpose, does not have any reference to pay protection or salary continuation for displaced employees, this policy somehow contemplates, in some respects, elements of pay protection, salary continuation. That's not the policy's purpose. And as it relates to bargaining unit, there are great ambiguities or indeed conflicts between this purpose and the MOU. And it doesn't create article of faith to negotiate something with a collective bargaining representative and have the agreements reflected in an MOU, and then have a policy that potentially, and in our view, actually conflicts with the provisions of the MOU. So as it relates to the bargaining unit, our view is the MOU would be controlling. And so there's a third reason that we have a problem with this policy. As far as management employees are concerned, there is great ambiguity as this policy relates to the displacement process as it relates to management employees. Under this policy, one could make an argument that I, as a management employee, have worked here 7 months. I'm, quote, displaced. And now I submit to you, MLGW, a claim for 2 years' pay, unless I can be placed in a comparable job. I don't know of any organization, private or public, where such a result would happen. And I'm not sure it was intended that way. I mean, I don't think it was intended that way. But there can be an argument made. Now, the reference to 720 days, obviously, the intent was to say up to 720 days. But the words up to are not in this policy. It says 720 days. So someone with 7 months service can make a claim for 2 years' pay. Now, when I look at what you adopted, and I'm going to bring this to a close and be here to answer your questions. I don't want to speak. I want to be helpful to answer your questions, receive your comments. But when I looked at the new era of excellence that the President presented to some 800 people earlier in the week, containing an overview of MLGW's 2005-2010 strategic plan, and look at your strategic areas of focus: customer stakeholder focus, relationships, core business focus, reliability. Number 3, cost control focus and rates. This policy unnecessarily, in our view, if you look at the purpose to define what this intent was, exposes the division to claims of pay protection, salary continuation, lack of flexibility, all of which have cost implications to this division. I think it's inconsistent with your strategic plan on cost control focus. And when you look at the framework for excellence, the first item, public trust, I don't believe we're fulfilling the public trust to have a policy that's ambiguous and indeed in conflict with an M.O.U. and providing for certain windfall payments that could be argued to exist in situations where someone works 6 months and claims 2 years' pay. I don't think Coors would ever contemplate such a policy, or any other in that industry, or any other successful leading company. And I think that when you look at your earlier strategic plan, the one that ended in this year, 2004, when I looked at the community, it said this utility, this MLGW, this treasure of our community should operate more like a private company. And I think that we should use this as a model of how we should operate. And of course, the policies help define how we're going to operate. That's the whole purpose of them. They're guidelines. They're not contracts. They're guidelines. And in our view, and without being unnecessarily, I think, critical of this, it's an outdated policy that's outlived its usefulness, and I think creates confusion because of its ambiguity. It creates conflicts with other policies or documents, and I think it exposes the division to unnecessary liability, and in our view, would warrant a serious consideration to be revised or rescinded. But I'm here, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, members of the board, to comment further if you'd like, or answer your questions.
Arnold, in regards to your experience, you have a national practice. You have been exposed to firms in a variety of sizes and different points of transition. This is a broad question. To what degree do you see the personnel policies in general here at MLGW? And I'm not sure to what degree you've been exposed to the other policies, but to what degree are we similar to private firms which have created quilt works of policies and at some point in time, they have to go in and just really redo all the policies to bring in internal consistencies with the policies. I mean, are we at that point in terms of the level of sophistication of what our policies are?
Well, I really can't answer your direct question because I was asked to review only this one policy. Now, I did look at the policies that are referenced in 22-21, but I did not review the policies in their totality. If this policy, 22-21, is at all representative of any of the other policies, I think there is a basic problem of consistency, of ambiguity, and of conflict. And I think that, I'm also, driven by visions and missions and statements of principles, because I think when I look at framework for excellence, this president, this board, I applaud you for basically setting yourself up in a transparent way of saying, we're going to have a framework for excellence. And I think if you do that, it has to be across the board and it has to cover policies, because these are guidelines of how we're going to operate. And I really applaud the president for examining policies as part of a framework for excellence. It's easy to say framework for excellence, just like it's easy to say human resources. It begs the issue, how are we going to be judged in the end? And I think that this isn't determinative of that result, but I think, Mr. Clark, to have policies that enable you to achieve a framework for excellence would be quite important. And I would think, based on this one policy, it certainly doesn't create confidence. And I would think that it may warrant reviewing many other policies to evaluate whether or not they're really what were intended originally, and certainly what you would want in this new environment today.
What would be the procedure for amending, changing, or revoking this policy? And what would be our responsibilities?
Well, one thing that I found quite interesting, Mr. Chairman, is I asked our general counsel to pull the records to see if the board had ever approved this policy by way of resolution. And apparently the board had not, that we couldn't find anything after scouring the files and the records. So this one was approved by administration. And so, and again, back to Commissioner Hassan's statement earlier, if that was the case, then I could have kind of unapproved it without the board's approval. But again, I think at this transitional stage of the company, I think it's important for me to bring major issues before you. So I wanted you to see this particular policy. Now, I have looked at several others as well. We have some good, effective policies, but we do indeed have a number of other policies that probably warrant thorough review. And one of the things I had mentioned earlier, even to the board, is that I think at an appropriate time, we wanted to do a full policy review so that we can really see what we have. Some policies may, in fact, be very inconsistent with our new strategic plan and the vision of cost effectiveness and reliability, as well as customer and stakeholder focus. We are in need of some policies for areas that we don't have policies, areas that have caused some concern around the company, albeit areas that on the surface would seem to be reasonable, such as job rotations. In the clearest sense, that would be an opportunity to allow for cross-training and widened breadth of skill levels. But believe it or not, some staffers in the company have great, discontent with job rotations from their view, and that they may not have benefited from those, and others have. And so that's an issue, of course. And so there's other ones that we have to look at. The nepotism policy is people at the company, a number of staffers across the company, and electric, gas, and water, ask me continuously, why don't we have the same policy as the city of Memphis as it relates to nepotism? And so MLGW is totally different in that respect. And so some historical basis is there, I'm sure. But I think that now is probably the time, as we look at the company across all of its functionalities, I think it's very clear that we need to do a very thorough reassessment of all of our policies. I think this particular policy at this point in time, I'm inclined to actually just want to revoke this one at this point in time and undertake a policy review, and then at the appropriate time come back to the board with an update on that review. What did we find? What are the results? And kind of have a laundry list of those that we deem appropriate for revision, new policies that we want to bring forward, and any policies that we deem worthy of discontinuing.
Do you know when the last time this policy was used?
Well, I don't know if my human resources manager is here, but she can actually tell me when the last time we did a displacement. Marcia Mason, you want to just say when the last time we did a displacement and position a person? It probably was recently.
Well, it hasn't been used very much at all.
Well, you want to say about how frequently we use this policy?
We rarely, the majority of the time that policy is used to displace employees that are in the field that have strenuous working conditions, and they have perhaps been injured on the job and no longer can climb or no longer can walk or whatever. So we make an attempt to displace those people. But the latest displacement we've had has been, we displaced 2 of our executive secretaries. That's been the last time.
What triggered your desire to look at this policy? What started this?
Well, my desire to look at this policy, it was several issues that made me look at this policy. And I'll be quite frank with you, Mr. Commissioner, one of the issues was, and I'll just say, subtle threats, if you will, from individuals around the company that said, you can't move me to another position because if you do, I'm gonna get 2 years pay.
Right.
And things of that nature. So I think this policy, you know, it can create a situation, if you will, that could hamper the company from making appropriate adjustments as the organization sees appropriate. And I think that given the ambiguities with this policy, it's very clear that it's something that probably is way over the top.
Absolutely, and whatever triggered it, and I hear what you're saying, I have to applaud you for looking at it, and number 2, for hiring Mr. Perle, who's a very astute attorney, for looking at something like this. There are so many ambiguities in here, and you set yourself, you set us up, the organization, for a lot of lawsuits, a lot of problems, and I think it needs to be scrapped. Totally.
Does the city government have a displacement policy?
I can address that. We do not. The only thing that we do have is in our memorandums of understanding, we have reduction in workforce provisions that set forth a seniority mechanism under which if their workforce is reduced, that persons will be placed or displaced based on certain seniority criteria. But as for the unrepresented persons, we have no policy, and there is nothing in our personnel manual that addresses this issue. I will also say that the city of Memphis just engaged, well, actually, the prior year in 2003, when I was Human Resources Director, we did a 12-month review of every single city personnel policy. We looked at the policies of the county, the airport authority, and then went to the national database for the Society of Human Resource Professionals and pulled their best practices. And while I was not looking at this particular issue at all, as we didn't have a policy and were not interested in having one, I can tell you that in my review, I saw nothing of any comparable anywhere in the country. And I will say that the majority of public governmental entities, certainly within this area, and I think across the country, have really undergone in the last 5 years a comprehensive review of their personnel policies and just trying to keep up with the marketplace in the private sector.
Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to say that we do have a policy on looks called 2104, I believe it is, which does deal with reduction in force and has a provision where an employee who's reduced or moved around gets up to 2 weeks' pay. And this is in conflict with that too.
And then in terms of how this policy has been used historically, it sounds like it's really been used from the standpoint of almost addressing ADA issues in terms of reasonable accommodation of employees who end up not being able to continue in their current position and needing to be transferred into another position.
Yeah.
And is that really the way it's been practiced? I mean, process. Okay.
Commissioner can speak to
I
that.
just again wanted to, Mr. Lee, commend you for looking at the policy and starting the process of looking at things from a cost control standpoint. And when I got the information that you had hired or engaged Attorney Perle to do this, I knew that whatever we got back in terms of a response was going to be ironclad from a legal standpoint. He would give us sound advice. I've worked with him for the last 3 years with the Public Building Authority, and I assure you, when you bring out things that say public trust or cost control, he's a stickler for that. I would like to see us give a little more consideration to this in terms